How did a quiet Thanksgiving joke about my mother's limited time end with my brother voluntarily locking himself into treatment just to reach the money I promised him? Why did he believe I would break first, when every condition was already signed? This is how I ended years of manipulation, by letting him chase a reward he couldn't shortcut. The dining room felt exactly like every other Thanksgiving we'd shared in this house. The same oak table that had hosted 30 years of family meals. The same cream-colored walls lined with photos of better times. The same careful dance around topics that might upset the fragile peace Mom worked so hard to maintain. But something was different this year, and it took me 20 minutes to figure out what. The centerpiece was beautiful. Mom had always been particular about her holiday arrangements. White chrysanthemums intertwined with autumn leaves, small pumpkins tucked between flickering candles, everything arranged with deliberate care. But wrapped around the bouquet's stems, secured by a small silk bow, was a thin, black ribbon, the kind reserved for moments of mourning. I stared at it, while Aunt Leora talked about her neighbor's new dog, and Mom passed around the stuffing for the second time. The ribbon was subtle enough that most people might miss it, but once you noticed it, you couldn't look away. It felt deliberate, purposeful. "Colby," I whispered, leaning toward my older brother as he reached for another dinner roll. "You think this is funny?" He followed my gaze to the centerpiece, and his face broke into that familiar smirk, the one that had gotten him out of trouble as a kid and into it as an adult. "It's free," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "Besides, she doesn't have much time left anyway." The words hit me like ice water. Not because they were shocking. Colby had always been blunt about uncomfortable truths, but because of how much he seemed to enjoy saying them. He was watching my face, measuring my reaction, savoring the moment when his casual cruelty landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Mom was 68 and had been managing a few health concerns, but she was nowhere near the end of her days. The doctors were optimistic about her treatment, and she'd been feeling better lately. But Colby had a way of taking any uncertainty and twisting it into something darker, more convenient for whatever point he was trying to make. "Did you put that there?" I asked, nodding toward the ribbon. "Maybe." He shrugged, taking a bite of his roll. "Found it in the flower shop parking lot. Seemed like a waste to leave it there." Aunt Leora had stopped talking about the dog and was looking at us with that expression she got when she sensed tension, but wasn't sure where it was coming from. Mom was busy cutting her turkey into smaller pieces, either oblivious to our conversation or choosing to ignore it. "That's sick, even for you," I said quietly. "It's practical," Colby replied. "Besides, someone's got to think about these things. Can't all live in denial like you do." He said it loud enough that Aunt Leora definitely heard, though she pretended not to. Mom looked up from her plate, caught the tail end of our exchange, and gave us both that look, the one that said she knew we were arguing but was choosing to believe it was about something harmless. "Everything okay over there?" she asked with forced cheerfulness. "Just fine, Mom," Colby said smoothly. "Wilder was asking about your beautiful centerpiece. I told him you have excellent taste." The lie came so easily, delivered with such practiced sincerity, that for a moment even I almost believed it. Mom smiled, pleased by the compliment, and launched into a story about choosing the flowers at the farmer's market that morning. Colby listened with apparent interest, nodding at all the right moments, the picture of a devoted son. But I caught him glancing at the black ribbon twice during her story, and each time that same satisfied smirk flickered across his face. He was enjoying this, not just the joke itself, but the fact that he could sit there, accepting Mom's gratitude for his compliment while knowing exactly what he'd done. It was manipulation in its purest form, casual cruelty disguised as concern. This was Colby in a nutshell. Always testing boundaries, always pushing to see how much he could get away with. The memorial ribbon was just his latest experiment in seeing who would call him out and who would let it slide. And based on the way Aunt Leora was studiously avoiding eye contact and Mom was beaming at his false praise, he was getting exactly the reaction he wanted. As Mom continued her story about the farmer's market, I found myself studying my brother's face. At 44, Colby still had that boyish charm that had always gotten him out of trouble. But there were lines around his eyes now that spoke of too many late nights and too much alcohol. His hands shook slightly when he reached for his water glass, so slightly that most people wouldn't notice, but I'd been watching for signs like that for years. The memorial ribbon wasn't just a cruel joke, it was a preview. Colby was already thinking ahead, already planning for a future where Mom wasn't around to protect him from the consequences of his choices, and he wanted me to know it. The pattern had been established for so long that none of us really questioned it anymore. Colby would mess up, the family would rally around him, and somehow everything would work out. Not for him exactly, but for the idea of family harmony that Mom held so dear. It started when we were kids. Colby was 3 years older, naturally charming, and had a talent for making his problems seem like temporary setbacks rather than character flaws. When he got suspended for cheating in high school, it became a story about academic pressure. When he got arrested for drunk driving in college, it was about stress and bad influences. When he lost his third job in 2 years, it was the economy, bad bosses, office politics, anything except the fact that he'd been showing up hungover more often than not. I'd spent my 20s building a consulting business from nothing, working 80-hour weeks, living in a studio apartment so I could reinvest everything back into the company. By the time I was 35, I had 40 employees and enough financial stability to help my family when they needed it, which, it turned out, was often. Colby's emergencies had a way of coinciding with my business successes. When I landed my first major contract, he needed help with rent. When I sold a piece of the company to investors, he needed money for a lawyer. When I bought my first house, he needed help with medical bills that somehow never came with actual medical records. The family response was always the same. Mom would call, sounding stressed and apologetic. Aunt Leora would mention how worried everyone was. The implication was clear. I had the means to help, and helping family was what good people did. The fact that my success had come from years of sacrifice and careful planning, while Colby's problems came from a series of increasingly poor decisions, was beside the point. "He's trying," Mom would say whenever I expressed frustration. "He just needs a little support to get back on his feet." But Colby was never trying to get back on his feet. He was trying to avoid having to stand up in the first place. Every bailout bought him a few more months of avoiding real consequences, and every consequence he avoided made him more confident that someone else would always step in to catch him. The rehab attempts were the perfect example. Over the past 5 years, Colby had been to 3 different treatment programs. Each time, the family had rallied around him, praising his courage for seeking help, promising support for his recovery, treating his addiction like a medical condition rather than a series of choices. And each time he'd lasted exactly long enough to convince everyone he was serious before finding a reason to leave early. The first program was too rigid. The second one didn't understand his specific needs. The third one was making his anxiety worse. There was always a reason, always delivered with enough medical terminology and emotional vulnerability that questioning it felt cruel. But I'd noticed something the family hadn't. Each rehab attempt coincided with a period when his other options were running out. When his girlfriend kicked him out, he discovered he needed treatment for his drinking. When his boss threatened to fire him, he realized he needed help managing stress. When his credit cards got maxed out, he understood that his relationship with alcohol was affecting his judgment about money. Treatment wasn't about getting sober. It was about buying time and sympathy while he figured out his next move. The real revelation came last Christmas, when I overheard him on the phone with someone, probably his friend Jace, based on the conversation. They were talking about Mom's health scare from earlier that year, and Colby was explaining how it had put things in perspective. "The old man left everything to her," he was saying, "and she's not getting any younger. I mean, I love her, but let's be realistic about the timeline here." He wasn't talking about spending more time with her or making sure she was comfortable. He was talking about positioning himself to inherit, about being the good son who was present and involved when the time came, about making sure his name was on the right paperwork when decisions needed to be made. The memorial ribbon on the Thanksgiving centerpiece wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a declaration. Colby was done pretending this was about family loyalty or getting his life together. He was thinking strategically now, and he wanted me to know it. But what Colby didn't understand, what he'd never understood, was that his confidence was built on a foundation of other people's choices to enable him. Mom chose to forgive him because confrontation was harder than peace. Aunt Leora chose to stay neutral because taking sides was uncomfortable. I chose to help him because the alternative was watching the family fall apart. All of those choices could be changed. As I sat there watching him enjoy his cruel little joke, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. Colby didn't think he was smarter than the rest of us. He thought we were weaker. He thought our love for family harmony made us predictable, controllable, ultimately powerless to stop him from taking whatever he wanted. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The conversation in the kitchen happened while Mom was looking for her good serving spoon, and Aunt Leora was in the bathroom. Colby and I were alone for the first time all day, and he seemed determined to make the most of it. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" he said, leaning against the counter with that casual confidence that had always irritated me. "How different things are going to be when it's just us making decisions." "What do you mean?" "Come on, Wilder. You're not stupid." He gestured toward the dining room, where we could hear Mom humming while she rearranged something on the table. "She's not going to be around forever, and when that time comes, someone's going to have to handle things. The house, her finances, all the practical stuff she doesn't want to think about." The way he said, "handle things," made it clear he wasn't talking about honoring Mom's wishes or making sure her final years were comfortable. He was talking about control, about being the one who decided what happened to the family assets when she was no longer able to protect them. "I've been thinking it might be good if I was more involved in that stuff now," he continued. "You know, gradually take on more responsibility, make sure everything's organized and ready when the time comes." Organized for what? For whatever needs to happen. He shrugged. Selling the house, managing her care, making sure everything gets distributed fairly. Someone has to be the point person for all that, and let's be honest, you're busy with your business. I've got more flexibility in my schedule. By flexibility in his schedule, he meant he was unemployed again. His last job had ended 3 months ago under circumstances he'd never fully explained, and as far as I knew, he wasn't actively looking for another one. But somehow he'd reframed his unemployment as an asset, a sign that he was available to take on family responsibilities. "Have you talked to Mom about this?" I asked. "A little. She appreciates having me around more. I've been helping her with errands, driving her to appointments. She mentioned that it's nice to have someone she can count on." The implication was clear. He was the reliable son, the one who was present and involved, while I was the distant one who only showed up for holidays and emergencies. Never mind that I'd been the one paying for her car repairs and medical bills. Never mind that I called her twice a week and visited every month. Colby was positioning himself as the devoted caregiver, and Mom, who hated conflict and loved having her sons get along, was probably encouraging him without realizing what she was encouraging. "I'm not trying to cut you out or anything," he said with false generosity. "But someone needs to be thinking ahead, and I'm in a better position to handle the day-to-day stuff." Through the kitchen window, I could see Aunt Leora coming back from the bathroom, and I knew our private conversation was about to end. But Colby had one more thing to say. "The thing is, Wilder, you've always been better at the big picture stuff. strategy, planning, all that business school thinking. But this is different. This is about being present, being available when she needs someone. And honestly, I think she's starting to see the difference between someone who sends money and someone who shows up. He said it with a smile, like he was giving me helpful feedback rather than delivering a calculated insult. But the message was unmistakable. He was building a case for why he should be the one making decisions about Mom's care and finances, and he was confident that his physical presence would outweigh my financial contributions when the time came to make that case. The drive home gave me time to think clearly for the first time all day. Colby wasn't just being opportunistic, he was executing a plan. He'd figured out that Mom's health concerns created an opportunity, and he was positioning himself to take advantage of it. The memorial ribbon, the comments about her limited time, the talk about taking on more responsibility, it was all connected. But there was something else, something that bothered me more than his greed or his callousness. It was his confidence. Colby genuinely believed he could manipulate his way into control of Mom's affairs, and he believed it because it had always worked before. Every time he'd created a crisis, the family had rallied to solve it. Every time he'd needed money, someone had provided it. Every time he'd faced consequences, someone had intervened to soften them. He thought I was predictable. He thought my love for Mom and my desire to keep the family together made me weak, made me someone who could be manipulated and controlled. He thought he understood my limits and my motivations, and he thought that understanding gave him power over me. Sitting in my car in my own driveway, I opened a folder on my phone that I'd created months earlier but never acted on. It was labeled Options, and it contained research I'd done during his last rehab stint, when I'd started to suspect that his pattern of seeking treatment and then leaving early wasn't accidental. The folder contained information about long-term inpatient programs, legal documents related to addiction treatment, and contact information for attorneys who specialized in family intervention strategies. I'd put it together during a moment of frustration, thinking that someday I might need to take more decisive action to protect Mom from Colby's increasingly erratic behavior. I'd never expected to use it as the foundation for something more strategic. But as I sat there, thinking about Colby's confidence that he could outmaneuver me, thinking about his casual cruelty toward Mom, thinking about his assumption that I would always choose family peace over family justice, I realized something important. Colby's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. His greed made him predictable. His addiction made him desperate. His confidence made him careless. And his assumption that I would always be the responsible one, the one who cleaned up his messes, meant he would never see me coming when I decided to create a mess he couldn't escape. I scrolled through the contacts in my options folder and started making calls. The law office of Patricia Hendricks specialized in what she called intervention contracting, legal agreements designed to help families create accountability for members struggling with addiction. I'd found her name during my research into Colby's previous rehab attempts, but this was the first time I'd actually made an appointment. The challenge with addiction treatment, she explained during our initial consultation, is that the person with the addiction holds most of the power. They can leave treatment at any time, for any reason, and there's very little the family can do about it. But there are ways to structure incentives that change that dynamic. Her office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who dealt with family crises for a living. Comfortable but not luxurious, designed to put people at ease during what were probably the most stressful conversations of their lives. The walls were lined with certificates and degrees, but also with photos of families, presumably clients whose lives had been improved by her services. "Tell me about your brother's pattern," she said, pulling out a legal pad. I walked her through Colby's history, the failed rehab attempts, the family bailouts, the increasing manipulation around Mom's health and finances. I explained his latest comments about taking on more responsibility and his obvious plans to position himself as Mom's primary caregiver and decision-maker. He's not actually interested in getting sober, I concluded. He's interested in maintaining access to family resources while avoiding any real consequences for his choices. And he's gotten very good at using our love for him against us. Patricia nodded. I see this pattern frequently. The family member with addiction learns to weaponize other people's compassion. They become expert at finding the exact amount of progress they need to show to keep the support flowing without ever committing to real change. So what can we do about it? We create a situation where the only way to get what he wants is to actually complete treatment. No shortcuts, no early exits, no manipulation. He gets rewarded for success, but only for complete success. She explained the concept of a conditional reward contract. The family would offer a significant financial incentive for completing a long-term inpatient treatment program, but the money would only be released upon successful completion of the entire program. Any early departure, for any reason, would result in forfeiting the entire amount. The key is making the reward large enough that he can't ignore it, but structuring it so that he can't access it without doing exactly what you want him to do, she said, and making sure that all the conditions are legally binding and irrevocable once he signs. What kind of amount are we talking about? That depends on what motivates him. For some people, it's $5,000. For others, it's $50,000. You know your brother better than I do. What would make him willing to commit to 6 months of inpatient treatment? I thought about Colby's debts, his unemployment, his dreams of having access to Mom's assets. $25,000, I said. That's enough to solve his immediate problems and give him a fresh start. It's also enough that he wouldn't be able to walk away from it easily. And you're prepared to put that money in escrow? Yes, but I want conditions beyond just completing treatment. Patricia raised an eyebrow. What kind of conditions? I want a clause that removes him from any involvement in my mother's financial affairs, permanently. If he takes the money, he agrees that he will never seek power of attorney over her, will never contest her will never attempt to influence her financial decisions. The reward comes with a price. He gets his fresh start, but he gives up any claim to controlling the family assets. That's more comprehensive than most families request. My brother has been manipulating this family for years. If I'm going to pay him to get sober, I want to make sure he can't use his sobriety as leverage for more manipulation down the road. Patricia was quiet for a moment, making notes on her legal pad. This is definitely possible, but it requires very careful language. He has to understand exactly what he's agreeing to, and he has to sign everything voluntarily. If there's any suggestion that he was coerced or didn't understand the terms, the whole agreement could be challenged. He'll understand. Colby is very motivated by money, and he's very confident in his ability to outsmart systems. He'll think he can find a way to get the reward without meeting all the conditions. And you don't think he can? I think his addiction makes him impatient, and his arrogance makes him careless. He'll sign the agreement because he'll be focused on the money, not the fine print. And once he's in treatment, he'll discover that there are no shortcuts to getting what he wants. We spent the next 2 hours sorting through the specifics. The agreement required Colby to complete at least 6 months in a family-approved residential recovery program. He would undergo regular substance screenings, attend all mandatory therapy sessions, and obtain an official completion certificate from the program director. More importantly, he would have to agree to a permanent separation from Mom's financial affairs. The contract would include language stating that by accepting the reward money, he acknowledged that he was not suitable to serve as her power of attorney, would not contest any estate planning decisions she made, and would not attempt to influence her financial choices through emotional manipulation or claims about his sobriety. The beauty of this approach, Patricia explained, is that it gives him exactly what he says he wants, money and a fresh start, while protecting your mother from exactly what you're afraid he'll do. He can't have both the reward and the control. He has to choose. What if he refuses to sign? Then you've learned something important about his priorities. But based on what you've told me about his financial situation and his confidence in his own abilities, I don't think he'll refuse. The mistake most families make is offering consequences for bad behavior. This offers rewards for good behavior, which is much more appealing to someone with addiction. And if he tries to leave treatment early? Then he forfeits the money, and the separation clause still applies. The contract is structured so that he only benefits if he completes everything exactly as specified. Any deviation costs him everything. As I drove home from Patricia's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to dealing with Colby. Control. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to his manipulation or trying to minimize the damage from his latest crisis. I was setting the terms of engagement, and those terms were designed to give him exactly one path to getting what he wanted, the path that required him to actually change. The conversation with Mom was easier than I'd expected. I'd been prepared for resistance, questions about why I was taking such a hard line with Colby, concerns about whether this was the right approach for someone struggling with addiction. Instead, she listened quietly while I explained the plan, asked a few practical questions, and then surprised me with her response. "I've been waiting for someone to do something like this," she said. We were sitting in her living room, the same room where we'd had so many conversations about Colby over the years. The memorial ribbon from Thanksgiving was gone. I'd noticed its absence immediately when I arrived, but she hadn't mentioned removing it, and I hadn't asked. "You've been waiting?" "Wilder, I'm not blind. I know what your brother is doing. I know he's not really trying to get sober, and I know he's not helping me out of the goodness of his heart. He's positioning himself to take over my affairs, and he thinks I don't see it." This was not the conversation I'd expected to have. For years, Mom had been the one defending Colby, making excuses for him, asking the family to be patient while he figured things out. Hearing her speak so clearly about his manipulation was jarring. "Why haven't you said anything?" "Because I didn't know what the alternative was. I can't force him into treatment, and I can't cut him off completely. He's still my son. But I also can't let him destroy himself while he destroys everyone else. What you're proposing gives him a real chance to get better, but it also protects me from his worst impulses." She read through Patricia's contract carefully, asking questions about specific clauses and making sure she understood the implications. When she got to the section about Colby's permanent separation from her financial affairs, she nodded approvingly. "This is good," she said. "He needs to understand that getting sober doesn't automatically make him trustworthy with money, and I need to know that my decisions about my own care and my own assets won't become leverage he can use against me." "Are you sure you're comfortable with this? It's a pretty aggressive approach." "Honey, I've tried gentle approaches for 20 years. They don't work. Maybe it's time to try something that actually has consequences attached to it." Aunt Leora was our witness when Mom signed the agreement. Leora had been quiet during most of our family dramas over the years, but she'd also been paying attention. When I explained what we were doing, her response was immediate. "It's about time." "You think this will work?" I asked. "I think it's the first plan anyone's come up with that doesn't reward him for failing," she said. "And I think your mother deserves to spend her golden years without worrying about whether her son is going to manipulate her into giving him control over her life." The bank meeting was purely procedural. $25,000 went into an escrow account with very specific release conditions. The money would only be accessible to Colby upon presentation of a completion certificate from an approved treatment program and confirmation that all other contract requirements had been met. Until then, it might as well not exist. When I finally approached Colby with the offer, I chose my setting carefully. We met at a coffee shop near his apartment, neutral territory, public enough that he couldn't create a scene, but private enough that we could speak freely. I'd brought a copy of the contract, but I presented the offer verbally first. "I've been thinking about what you said on Thanksgiving," I began, "about taking on more responsibility with Mom, about being more involved in family decisions, And I think you're right that you need to be in a better position to handle that kind of responsibility. Colby looked suspicious but interested. What do you mean? I mean, I think your drinking is going to be a problem if you're going to be Mom's primary caregiver, and I think you know that too, which is why you've tried rehab before. But I also think you've never had the right incentive to stick with it. I explained the offer: 6 months of inpatient treatment at a high-quality facility, with all expenses paid by the family, and a $25,000 reward for successful completion. I presented it as an investment in his future, a way for him to get the help he needed while also getting the financial stability to take on more family responsibilities. 25,000? His eyes lit up exactly the way I'd expected them to. Upon completion. The money goes into escrow now, but you only get it when you finish the program and get your completion certificate. What if the program doesn't work out? What if it's not the right fit? Then you don't get the money. The deal is completion, not attendance. You have to finish the whole thing. I watched him process this information. I could see him calculating. 6 months was a long time, but $25,000 was more money than he'd seen at once in years. And he was confident, I could see it in his expression, that he could find a way to work the system. Maybe he could get the completion certificate without actually staying the full 6 months. Maybe he could convince the family to release the money early if he showed enough progress. Maybe he could negotiate better terms once he was already in treatment. What about Mom's stuff? The house, her finances, all that? What about it? I mean, if I'm getting sober, if I'm proving I can be responsible, doesn't that put me in a better position to help her with those decisions? Let's focus on getting you through treatment first, I said. One thing at a time. He asked a few more questions about the treatment facility, the timeline, the specifics of the reward. But I could tell he'd already decided. The money was too good to pass up, and he was too confident in his own abilities to believe he couldn't find a way to get it without meeting every single requirement. When I finally showed him the contract, he skimmed it quickly, focusing on the sections about the money and the treatment requirements. He spent less than 30 seconds on the clauses about his separation from Mom's financial affairs, exactly what I'd hoped for. This seems pretty straightforward, he said. When do I start? As soon as you sign and we get you admitted. I can make the calls today. He signed without reading the fine print. He signed because he was focused on the reward, not the conditions. He signed because he thought he was smarter than the system I'd created. And he signed because $25,000 was exactly the kind of shortcut he'd been looking for his entire adult life. 3 days later, I drove him to the Meadowbrook Treatment Center, a residential facility about 2 hours outside the city. He was in a good mood during the drive, talking about his plans for the money, his ideas for how to make the most of his time in treatment, his confidence that this was finally going to be the fresh start he needed. I appreciate you doing this, he said as we pulled into the parking lot. I know I haven't always been the easiest person to deal with, but this is going to change things. You'll see. I helped him carry his bags to the intake area, where a counselor was waiting to begin the admission process. Colby shook my hand, confident and relaxed, still thinking about the money that would be waiting for him in 6 months. I'll see you at graduation, he said with a grin. I watched him walk through the intake doors, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in relation to my brother for as long as I could remember. Hope. Not hope that he would change. I'd given up on that years ago. But hope that his choices would finally have consequences he couldn't manipulate his way out of. The doors closed behind him with a soft click. The call came 6 weeks into Colby's treatment. I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me excuse myself and take the call. Mr. Sorrell, this is Dr. Sylvie Lenton, the clinical director at Meadowbrook. I'm calling about your brother Colby. My first thought was that he'd hurt himself, or hurt someone else, or found some way to create a crisis that would require family intervention. Is he okay? He's fine physically, but he's been asking to speak with you about modifying the terms of his treatment agreement. He seems to believe that you have the authority to authorize an early release under certain circumstances. I'd been expecting this call, just not quite so soon. 6 weeks was longer than Colby had lasted in any previous treatment program, which meant the money was working as motivation. But it was also apparently long enough for him to start testing the boundaries of what he'd agreed to. What kind of circumstances? He's been making excellent progress in his individual therapy sessions, and he's become something of a leader in his group therapy meetings. He seems to believe that this progress should qualify him for early completion of the program, with the understanding that he would continue his recovery on an outpatient basis. And what do you think? I think 6 weeks is barely enough time to begin addressing 20 years of addictive behavior, but more to the point, I think the terms of his agreement are quite clear. He committed to 6 months of residential treatment, not 6 weeks of excellent behavior. Has he seen the contract recently? That's actually why I'm calling. He's requested a copy of the original agreement, and when we provided it, he seemed surprised by some of the language. Specifically, the clauses related to his family responsibilities and financial arrangements. He's asking if those sections are legally binding. I almost smiled. Colby had finally read the fine print, and he was discovering that the contract he'd signed so confidently was more comprehensive than he'd realized. They're absolutely legally binding, I said. He signed them voluntarily, with full legal representation available if he'd wanted it. What exactly is he questioning? The permanent separation from your mother's financial affairs. He seems to believe that successfully completing treatment should restore his eligibility to serve as her power of attorney or to be involved in her estate planning. The contract is very clear on that point. Taking the money means giving up any claim to financial authority over my mother. Those two things are permanently linked. Dr. Lenton was quiet for a moment. Mr. Sorrell, I have to ask, what happens if your brother decides the money isn't worth the restrictions? What if he chooses to leave treatment rather than complete the full program under these terms? Then he leaves, but he doesn't get the money, and the separation clause still applies. The contract is structured so that he only benefits if he does exactly what he agreed to do. And if he tries to challenge the contract legally? He can try, but he signed it voluntarily, and my mother has her own legal representation confirming that the financial separation is in her best interest. He'd be challenging a contract that protects an elderly woman from financial manipulation by a family member with a documented addiction history. Good luck finding a judge who's sympathetic to that argument. After I hung up, I called Patricia Hendricks to update her on the situation and confirm that our legal position was as strong as I believed it to be. This is exactly what we expected, she said. He's realizing that getting the money means giving up control, and he's trying to find a way to have both. The fact that he's testing the boundaries 6 weeks in actually suggests that the contract is working. He's engaged enough with treatment to stay longer than usual, but he's also discovering that there are no shortcuts to getting what he wants. What if he decides to leave? Then he's made his choice. He's decided that the possibility of future control over your mother's finances is more important to him than $25,000 and genuine sobriety. Either way, you've accomplished your goal of protecting her. The second call came 3 weeks later. This time it was Colby himself, calling from the treatment center's patient phone. Wilder, we need to talk. How are you doing, Colby? I'm doing great, really great. The counselors here think I'm making exceptional progress, but I'm starting to think this place might not be the right fit for my specific needs. Here it was. The same pattern he'd followed in every previous treatment attempt, just delayed by the financial incentive. He'd stayed long enough to convince himself and others that he was serious about recovery, and now he was looking for a reason to leave that would preserve his dignity and his options. What kind of specific needs? Well, for one thing, I think I'd benefit more from outpatient treatment at this point. I've learned what I need to learn about staying sober, and now I need to practice applying those skills in the real world. Staying here for another 3 months feels like overkill. The contract specifies 6 months of residential treatment. I know what the contract says, but contracts can be modified when circumstances change. I've exceeded everyone's expectations here, and I think that should count for something. It does count for something. It counts toward completing the program you agreed to complete. There was a long pause. When Colby spoke again, his voice had an edge to it that I recognized from years of similar conversations. Look, I've been thinking about this whole arrangement, and I'm not sure it's as fair as I originally thought. I mean, I'm doing everything right. I'm getting sober. I'm proving I can be responsible. But according to this contract, none of that matters when it comes to helping Mom with her finances. That's correct. Don't you think that's a little extreme? I mean, if I complete this program, if I prove I can stay sober, shouldn't that restore my standing in the family? Shouldn't that put me back in a position where I can help make important decisions? The money is your restoration, Colby. $25,000 to start over, debt-free, with 6 months of professional help to build the skills you need to stay sober. That's what you get for completing the program. But what about everything else? What about being able to help Mom when she needs it? You can help Mom by staying sober and being a good son. You just can't help her by controlling her money or her medical decisions. Another long pause. And if I decide this isn't worth it? If I decide to leave and handle my sobriety on my own terms? Then you leave, but you don't get the money, and you don't get access to Mom's financial affairs. The choice is entirely yours. This feels like blackmail. This feels like consequences. You spent 20 years making choices that hurt yourself and manipulated your family. Now you get to make a choice that either helps you get better or confirms that you're not ready to get better. But you don't get to make a choice that gives you everything you want without any of the things you don't want. The call ended without resolution, but I knew what was coming. Colby was going to have to decide whether $25,000 and genuine sobriety were worth giving up his dreams of controlling the family assets. And based on everything I knew about him, I was pretty sure which way that decision would go. The final call came from Dr. Lenton 2 days later. "Your brother has decided to complete the program," she said. "He's recommitted to the full 6 months, and he's signed an additional agreement acknowledging that he understands all the terms of his original contract." What changed his mind? I think he finally understood that his choice wasn't between the money and the control. His choice was between the money and nothing. The control was never really an option, regardless of what he decided about treatment. How do you think he'll do? Honestly, I think he'll complete the program because the financial incentive is too strong to ignore. Whether that translates into long-term sobriety is a different question. But from your family's perspective, you've accomplished something important. You've protected your mother from financial manipulation, and you've given your brother a genuine opportunity to get help. What he does with that opportunity is up to him. 3 months later, I received Colby's completion certificate in the mail, along with a letter from Dr. Lenton confirming that he had successfully finished all requirements of the residential program. The next day, I authorized the release of his $25,000. I never asked him what he planned to do with the money, and he never volunteered the information. But I did notice that he didn't come around the house as much. And when he did visit Mom, he didn't bring up her finances or offer to help with her paperwork. The memorial ribbon had taught me something important about my brother. He was always thinking ahead, always calculating his next move, always looking for ways to turn other people's love into his own advantage. But it had also taught me something important about myself. I could think ahead too, and when I did, I could create consequences that even Colby couldn't manipulate his way out of. The ribbon was gone from Mom's centerpiece, but its lesson remained. Some jokes aren't funny. Some patterns need to be broken. And sometimes, the only way to help someone you love is to stop letting them hurt the people you love more. Colby got his money. Mom got her protection. And I got something I'd never had before when it came to my brother. The certainty that his choices would finally have consequences he couldn't escape. The doors had closed behind him, both literally and figuratively, and this time I was the one holding the key.